Hey class, today we're going to start the nervous system, and today we're going to focus on just a general overview of what is the nervous system, and then discussing the cells that kind of make up our nervous system. So let's do a short introduction. The nervous system is the master control and communication system of the body, and all that means is that it's going to communicate with different cells through something called electrical impulses. These are very rapid, specific, and they cause an immediate response. For example, if you touch something hot, it's going to pull your arm back. If you need to process information very quickly in your head, such as reading or making a split decision to run, it does that. Now, our nervous system is a very important system that helps maintain homeostasis. And while homeostasis is controlled and kept with all the body systems working together, like I said, the nervous system plays a very important part. The other body system that plays an important part as well is going to be the endocrine system. And these two systems do help regulate our body, but they do it in a kind of a different way. Nervous system produces these rapid electrical nerve impulses that we're going to talk about in this chapter, while endocrine system tends to release hormones into the blood leisurely, which means usually hormones from the endocrine system are not going to be a rapid response. These include things like growth hormones, which happen over time. Now, with the function of the nervous system, there are three overarching or overlapping parts. And these three overlapping functions happen in our normal day-to-day decisions that we make. The first is sensory input. During this stage, this is when we are gathering information from our surroundings. And what happens is we have different receptors throughout our body that takes in different senses: smell, taste, touch, pressure, pain. And these receptors detect any kind of changes. We call these changes stimuli, and the stimuli can occur inside the body and outside the body. An example of a stimuli outside the body is the lights turning on and off. A stimuli inside our body is our body temperature rising or lowering. The second step is integration. This is when we take the information that we got from our sensory receptors and we process it either in our brain or our spinal cord. And it processes that information and interprets what action is needed to be done in order for us to maintain homeostasis in our body. The third function is motor output. This is the response that your brain or spinal cord decided to do. So, for example, this can activate muscles such as turning your hand on and off on a light switch, pulling your hand back from something hot, or it can stimulate glands, such as stimulating sweat glands to help cool you off if you're feeling too warm. So this picture helps illustrate those three overarching functions: sensory input, integration, motor output. The example I'm going to give you is if you are driving a car and you are currently sitting at a red light. You're going to see the light turn green, and you're going to take that in through sensory receptors in your eye. That's going to send a signal to your brain, and your brain's going to say, hey, the light turned green, and it's going to decide what action does it need to do next. It's going to decide that it needs to tell your muscles in your legs to contract and to push down on the gas pedal. And the motor output would be the leg actually pushing down on the gas pedal in order to accelerate your car. Now that we kind of understand the three overarching functions, we kind of have to understand the breakdown of nervous tissue that allows us to have the nerves that we do. Nervous tissue is actually made up of two main types of cells. The first one is supporting cells, and the second one are called neurons. Supporting cells are exactly what they sound like. They help support. While neurons, we typically call nerve cells. There are two major differences between these types of cells. The first is their ability to send a nerve impulse. Support cells are unable to conduct a nerve impulse. They cannot send a signal to a cell to tell it to do anything. And they never lose the ability to divide, which means if supporting cells get damaged, they can regenerate and produce new cells. Neurons, on the other hand, do conduct nerve impulses, but most of them lose the ability to divide. We call this amitotic. In other words, they do not undergo mitosis to create two new daughter cells. You've probably heard terms, if you have nerve damage, that is very hard to regenerate because these cells are not able to divide to create new cells. So that's why people usually have to try to look at stem cell treatment. So like we said on the previous slide, support cells have a overall general function of supporting, insulating, and protecting neurons. And sometimes you might hear support cells be called neuroglia, and this is just another name for support cells within our brain and our spinal cord. They can also go by glia or glial cells. Also, neurons, like we saw on the previous slide, this is another term for nerve cells. These are very specialized to transmit messages or nerve impulses from one part of our body to another. For example, from our brain to our foot, from our brain to our biceps. There are major regions for neurons. So what I mean by that is neurons come in all shapes and sizes. They're not all the same, but they do have similar structures that all of them have. The first is a cell body. Cell bodies contain the nucleus, and they are the metabolic center of the cell, so they do the primary functions that most cells do. And they also have processes, and all processes are fibers that extend off the cell body. Some neurons will have multiple processes, and some will just have a few. So the number is going to be different, but they do still have them. So let's look at this cell body. We said the cell body is the metabolic center of the neuron, and this is where the nucleus is located. Well, the cell body also has a pretty large nucleolus, and if you remember from that chapter, that is where our ribosomes are created. These cells also contain normal organelles that you would think, such as mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, ribosomes, but they do lack centrioles, which are very important for mitosis, and this explains their amitotic nature, which means their cells do not have the ability to divide. So if you do get damage to neurons, like we said on the previous slide, this is really hard to regenerate, which is why people look into stem cell. Here is a typical structure of a neuron, and this part right here that I'm pointing to, this circle part, would be considered our cell body. We have our nucleus here in purple and our nucleolus in the middle. Now, in terms of processes, these are going to extend off the cell body, and how they conduct a nerve impulse is going to determine if they are considered a dendrite or an axon. Special types of processes that conduct impulses towards the cell body are called dendrites. Neurons can have hundreds of dendrites. However, the fibers that conduct impulses away from the cell body are called axons. And neurons actually only have one axon that come from the cell body off of that axon hillock. And they end in axon terminals. This term should sound familiar because we talked about it when we did the muscular system. And the axon terminals contain vesicles with neurotransmitters. When we talked about the muscular system, we talked about how that neurotransmitter was called acetylcholine, but there are hundreds of different neurotransmitters that can be released in our body. So to kind of give you an idea, here we have the cell body. Dendrites are right here in the end. Notice it says direction of electrical impulse. These dendrites are going to send nerve impulses to our cell body. Then this part over here is labeled the axon. That's because our cell signal is now going away from the cell body to eventually get to these axon terminals. Now, axon terminals are separated from the next neuron by a gap called a synaptic cleft. For example, we saw this when we saw a neuron meet a muscle cell. Same thing happens when a neuron meets another neuron. They never actually touch. They do have that small gap. So here I have a picture of one neuron going into another neuron. We do see this little gap called a synapse. And the last major structure for neurons is something called a myelin sheath. Over here, this entire blue length is called the axon, but you're going to see these kind of clear white fatty material covering the axon, and that white fatty material functions to protect and insulate the fibers, and they also help speed up nerve impulse transmissions or to send signals faster. So essentially what they are is they're a specialized type of cell that helps cover the axon. So here's a close-up picture over here on the right. So neurons can actually be classified based on the direction the nerve impulse travels in relation to the brain or spinal cord. In future lessons, we're going to learn that the brain and spinal cord are called the CNS. There is sensory afferent neurons, motor efferent neurons, and interneurons. Sometimes we call those association neurons. Sensory, this is going to take in senses and carry those impulses from our senses to our brain. So this is going to be like lights turning on, we're getting too hot, I feel pain in my hand. Again, keyword, to the brain and spinal cord. Motor neurons, these are going to carry impulses away from our brain and spinal cord. And think of motor as in movement. This is going to send signals from our brain to muscles such as skeletal muscles or cardiac muscles, or to our glands to release different hormones. We have our sweat glands and our oil glands and our pancreatic glands to release pancreatic juices to digest food. So again, motor means away. And then of course we have these interneurons that connect sensory and motor neurons. Sometimes interneurons are used and sometimes they're not. To kind of give you a picture, here is a hand and it's touching a tack, so it senses pain. Our signal is going to be sent down our sensory neuron. It's going to enter, this is our spinal cord. Here we have an interneuron. And then this red line over here is our motor neuron. Once our spinal cord or our brain decides what to do, it's going to send a signal to our muscle that causes our hand to pull away from that thumbtack or that source of pain. Now, neurons can also be classified based on how many processes they have and not just the direction of their nerve transfer. So, processes, remember, are axons and dendrites. Multipolar neurons actually have many extensions, which means they're going to have an axon and they have multiple dendrites branching off of them. And almost all motor and interneurons are going to be multipolar, and this is the most common structural type. And we brought up this image on a previous slide because, like I said, this is the most common type that you are going to run into. You get a nerve signal in through your dendrites, it's going to go to your cell body, down your axon, to your axon terminal. However, multipolar neurons are not the only neurons out there. There's also something called a bipolar neuron. This is where you have one axon and one dendrite, so you don't have multiple dendrites going into a cell body. And these are often located in special sense organs such as the nose and eye, and are actually pretty rare in adult humans. They are only found in certain areas. So if we look at this one, we have the cell body here. Notice I only have one dendrite here and one axon. If we look back, notice how this is different. Here we have multiple dendrites going to the cell body. Oops. Notice this one we have one dendrite going to the cell body and one axon. We call it bi because one of each adds up to two. And the last one is called a unipolar neuron. This is one where we have a short single process that leaves the cell body, and that short process immediately splits into a proximal and distal end. And typically these are going to be found in sensory neurons outside of our brain and spinal cord. So this is going to be like senses we take in our arms, in our hands, our taste buds, things like that. And this is going to conduct impulses both towards and away from the cell body. So what I mean by unipolar is right here. We have a single thing off of the cell body. And that single short process then splits into, again, proximal and distal ends. This image is showing peripheral and central ends, but they mean the same thing. So that is the end of today's lesson. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I hope you guys have a great day.